I wanted to take some particular time to talk about a little bit about the mood that we are in this nation. And hopefully we'll spend some time with the first book of Samuel to help us reflect on where we are as a people, where we are as a nation, what is incumbent upon us as a beloved community. This is how the historians render a particular time in the life of God's people. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. Hannah's rival Peninnah used to provoke her severely, to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. And so it went on, year by year. So as often as she went up to the house of the Lord, Peninnah used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. Her husband Elkanah said to her, "Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons?" Sounds like a man, doesn't it? After they had eaten and drunk at Shiloh, Hannah rose and presented herself before the Lord. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. Hannah was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made this vow, "O Lord of hosts, if only you will look on the misery of your servant and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a male child. Then I will set him before you as a Nazirite until the day of his death. He shall drink neither wine nor intoxicants, and no razor shall touch his head." As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying silently. Only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore, Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, "How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine." But Hannah answered, "No, no, no, no. I am a woman deeply troubled. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation all this time." Then Eli answered her, "Go in peace. The God of Israel grant the petition you have made." And she said, "Let your servant find favor in your sight." Then Hannah went her way and ate and drank with her husband, and her countenance was sad no longer. They rose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord. Then they went back to their house in Ramah. Elkanah knew his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. In due time, Hannah conceived and bore a son. She named him Samuel, for she said, "I have asked him of the Lord." Will you pray with me? Gracious and merciful one, thank you. Thank you for this worship celebration and this preaching moment. Hallow our time together. Make it your own. Speak a word to your people. Use this weak vessel and these lips of clay to say life-giving words that your people might hear and be transformed in its hearing. In your many names we pray. Amen. As the nation settles into the reality of the outcome of the most recent election, there have Been a lot of think pieces and analytical articles going around trying to explain what happened, what it means, and what it says about the electorate. Now, a lot of it is hokum. It will take some time and a lot more research to give us some lasting wisdom about what took place. And I've primarily avoided a few of them, although there have been a few that have resonated with me. And there has been one particular idea that I think helps us understand the personal motivation of every person. Understand the motivation of, it doesn't matter who people supported, but there's a mood, there is an understanding, there is a motivation behind our participation in our democracy. So no matter who you supported in the election, everybody who participated in the democratic process did so because they were concerned about the future. And it doesn't matter in which guise it came. For many, that concern about the future reached beyond the superficial or the temporary, and even in some cases, beyond the material. It reached beyond all of that to, for some, becoming almost existential. What I mean by that, every issue in the polls and exit polls highlights the concern about the future, specific things. What will happen to me? What will happen to my children? What will happen to my grandchildren? What will happen to the tribe to which I belong? What will happen to the nation that I once knew as this way and is becoming that way? What will I lose? Will I lose my status? Will I lose my place in the society? Do I have a future? Is my future secure? And in our text today, that question is the underlying theme. In our text today, at this moment in the history of the people of Israel, the underlying concern, the underlying question, both biblically and historically, is whether Israel has a future. And it was a relevant question because God's chosen people had fallen into moral and political anarchy since the days of Moses and Joshua. The great leaders had gone off the stage, and a series of people doing all that they could to understand themselves as God people. The question was, is there a future for us? The book of Judges closes with a disturbing coda that sets the context for the story of Hannah. In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. And this is the moment that we meet Hannah, one of the most important biblical figures in Judaism and Christianity, the mother of the prophet Samuel, who will be the God-chosen maker and anointer of kings. Samuel, the one through whom God works to secure Israel's future. Hannah's story begins in sadness. Like many of the matriarchs of the faith, I'm thinking Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel before her. Hannah is barren. And I know some of you have been reading the Bible long enough to know that the barren woman is a theological trope. And so there's a reason why the Bible depends on this trope. So this theological trope of the infertile woman is the tip-off for us and the tip-off for the readers that God's grace and providence will be needed to shift the trajectory of history. Brace yourself, because God's about to get to work. God's about to do something. And so Hannah's barrenness is put before us to see if or how God will show up for a people despairing about the future. And then when we look at it on a personal level, Hannah's situation is compounded by the people around her who are anything but helpful. Her husband's other wife, Peninnah, ridicules and mistreats her. Her husband, Elkanah, who, though he loved her deeply, self-centeredly believes that his love can make up for her grief, that his love can make up for the cultural marginalization of women. And then her religious leader, the priest Eli, he misunderstands her completely, accusing her of being drunk, even though she is at her most faithful and trusting. So you get a sense that not only is Hannah struggling to make sense of her situation, not only is she bringing to bear on her own self, carrying this weight about the future, she's also being robbed of her worth and dignity. And so the issue at stake here for her, for Israel, it's still about the future. For Elkanah and Hannah, to be barren means that there is no future. And for Israel, if Samuel is not born, there is no future. But here's the thing about Hannah. I want you to stick with Hannah throughout, because she's quite amazing. Hannah did what the faithful do in times of fear, anxiety, defeat, and desperation. Hannah went to church. That's right. Hannah went to church. She went to worship. She went where God inhabits both the space and the praises of God's people. But she didn't just go to worship. She went with audacity and courage. She doesn't stand on ritual or tradition. She prays to God about her pain. She doesn't have time for the rituals. She's not looking for the animals to sacrifice. She's not waiting on her husband. She's going right to it and bearing her soul in her own words directly to God. Oh, you didn't react. Let me say it this way. She's supposed to be respectable in worship. She's supposed to follow the lead of the men in church. But no, Hannah says, I'm going to talk directly to God in my desperation. And let me put this little bit of historical nugget for you. She may very well be the first biblical character to privately pray to God without God initiating the conversation.
Go Hannah.
Amen. May very well be the first one that says, I'm not waiting on anybody. I'm praying to God. And so in her persistent address to God, without help from the priest, Hannah admits to God that her spirit is hardened, but she is pouring out her soul before the Holy One. And so in the context of prayer and sacrifice, Hannah could be honest at the place where God was present. She could lay bare her deepest pain and fear. She could say exactly what she was feeling. And then she can endure being patronized by her husband, ridiculed by her rival, and misunderstood by her priest for the sake of laying it out before God. I need you to remember me. Remember me. Remember me. And even in the worship space, I want you to rest there with Hannah, for she rests there with her. Hannah has to fight for her right to engage with God for the sake of her future. Eli is confused by her agency and audacity. And when he sees her speaking silent in the prayer, people don't do that, according to Eli. He thinks she's drunk. Oh, but Hannah doesn't hesitate or shrink at the accusation. She defends herself. She is persistent. I am not a worthless woman, but I am a servant who needs God to hear my prayer. I am a servant who needs God to remember her in her distress. And Eli is moved by her faithfulness. And he says a benediction that reminds them both that God does listen to God's people. God grant you the petition that you made. And with that benediction, with Eli's pronouncements of God's grace and faithfulness, Hannah leaves no longer sad, no longer desperate, no longer anxious. The worship experience, the communing with God in prayer fortifies her, lifts her spirit, and reminds her that she has a future. And for all she knows, and for all we know, she is still barren. But after attending worship, after going to church, that's right, after going to church, the historians say her countenance was sad no longer. Oh, we don't know how long it was between this moment and when Hannah finally conceives, but before the prayer is even answered, she finds her faith. She leaves worship in joy. She leaves worship reassured. There is a future. There is a future, Hannah. And sometime later, Hannah conceives that child and she gives birth. She names him Samuel. The future is upon them. There is a future. God indeed remembers Hannah. I hope today, sitting there, wherever you are, wherever the mood is, I hope we find peace in Eli's benediction, just like Hannah did. It affirmed God's willingness to hear and understand the anxious cries of faithful and trusting people, especially those on the margins, especially the oppressed and disinherited. Oh, yes, God's compassion may not come to us in the miraculous conception of a childless woman, but compassion nonetheless is how God reveals God's self in times of grief and disappointment. God's remembrance of us may not occur in the dramatic display of a supernatural miracle, but that God remembers at all. That God remembers God's beloved creation keeps open the possibility of newness and possibility. That this may just be how God lays the groundwork for God's agenda beyond the defeat, beyond our limited view of things. That there is grace working out things even when we don't know it's happening. That grace is working something out because something has to happen. And because grace is working out, there is a future. I also hope we spend some time reflecting on Hannah's example and the place of prayer and worship when we are experiencing defeat and when we are fearing what may happen in the future. Remember, as desperate as Hannah's situation was, she did not devolve into resignation and hopelessness. She did not give up. She did not give up. She did not let the priest dissuade her from saying what she needed to say to God. She did not stop. She did not acquiesce to the status quo that says, you're not going to have a child, so give up. She did not give up. The status quo that says women aren't worth anything unless they have children. No, she did not give up. She claimed her voice, claimed audacity, claimed her agency, and she kept going. Instead, she holds God accountable for God's promise to do a new thing and secure the future for her and for Israel. And I want us to hear this morning that promise is operative for us too. God has promised us life and that more abundantly. Don't go home in resignation. God has promised us a new thing and ask us to perceive it. Don't go home closing your ears off to what God is going to do. Let our grief, our fear, our anxiety about the future be the impetus for an honest appeal to God to hear us and remember us. And when we do, God is faithful and just during great pain, struggle, and desperation to remember us. There is grace beyond the defeat. There is a future because God's got a lot of work to do, and we may very well be the ones through whom God will do that work. So you can't go home. You can't give up. We have a future. It's on the horizon. Perceive it, use it, understand it. The disciples and followers of Jesus experienced that grace beyond defeat when they found the tomb that was supposed to hold his body empty, and they knew that there was a future. They knew that God was up to something, and they themselves may just be the ones through whom God will work to get it done. Oh, I know we've all been in that place when we wondered if our prayers were ever going to be answered. We grieve that they seem to always go unanswered. We've had that concern that God is absent and has abandoned us in our need. I've seen it just in the last few weeks since the election. So many people have been struggling to see a hopeful future. They have been despairing about all the ways that they will continue to be targeted, demeaned, and attacked. I'm talking especially about my transgender siblings who are trying to figure out, is there a future for me? I'm talking about all of those people who've been wondering, is there a future? Many of us have experienced the waning or the potential loss of faith when the future seems closed off. And meanwhile, my email is being flooded with people with all these plans to jump immediately to problem solving and agenda setting, to turn things around immediately. But sometimes, we should follow Hannah's example. Whatever we're going to do, we start first by going to God in prayer. Sometimes it helps to cry out in pain before God. Our penchant for problem solving and agenda setting, especially in a concern about our future, should not forestall going into God's presence to speak honestly about our hurt and ask God to be faithful and remember us. Remember us. And so this morning, I don't know what brought you here, but you're in the right place. You're in the right place right now. When we gathered for our post-election evensong, we were in the right place. The place of prayer and worship, where we appeal to God to remember us and to remember the vulnerable, to remember the disinherited. And you know, this isn't about how we can make God do something specific. This isn't a claim that God will answer every prayer we utter. This isn't an assurance that there will be no more grief, pain, and suffering. But this is a testimony that God remembers God's people. That God is present in our defeat, that there is always newness with God. There is always possibility. There is grace beyond the defeat, despair, and discouragement that we feel now. There is a future. It is unfolding even as you utter the prayer. God's theological agenda, as we saw in the story of Hannah, and I think up until this very moment, that theological agenda is all about the future. By God's grace, there is a future. No matter how bad things look now, how absolute the barrenness seems to us, there is grace beyond the defeat. It secures, that grace secures our future and transform it even if the reality of now appears hopeless. And here's what you can bank on. That grace is unstoppable. It flows from God's willingness to not only remember, but also to just hang out with you when you don't know what to do next. Always there. And so in light of God's faithfulness, may your countenance no longer be sad. May the assurance of God's grace open you to the future that awaits. May it be so.